In the summer of 1850, more than 500 ships sat abandoned in the shallow waters off San Francisco, their masts so thick they looked like a dead forest rising from the bay. Crews had walked off, captains had walked off, passengers had already vanished into the hills looking for gold. Nobody in this city wanted to sail anywhere. They wanted to dig. And so the ships just rotted where they sat. Until someone realized you could sink one on purpose, claim the mud beneath it as real estate, and build a saloon on top. That is the founding logic of the Barbary Coast. Not gold, not adventure. The insight that a ship full of drunk men with no way home was worth more than a ship that could actually sail. One of those abandoned vessels, a whaling ship called the Niantic, was dragged ashore and converted into a hotel, a saloon, and a warehouse, with a sign hung over a hole cut in its hull. Rest for the weary and storage for trunks. The Niantic made over $38,000, more than $1 million in today's money, on the single voyage that brought it to California. It earned considerably more sitting in the mud. It burned in the Great Fire of 1851, was buried under landfill, was built over, and was forgotten until construction workers dug it up again in 1978, near the foot of the Transamerica Pyramid. The place that would become the Barbary Coast sat at the eastern edge of San Francisco, on and around Pacific Street, a road that was, in those earliest years, the first street to cut through the city's hills, running from Portsmouth Square down to the shipping docks at Yerba Buena Cove. Before the gold rush, San Francisco barely existed. The population in 1847 was 492 people living in tents and wooden shanties. 2 years later, it was over 25,000. By the summer of 1850, it may have been closer to 40,000. A city had materialized out of nothing, and it had no government, no police force, no fire department, and no particular interest in acquiring any of those things. What it had was money. Staggering, disorienting, world-warping money. A single egg cost $1. A loaf of bread cost $1. Water was scarce. Garbage piled in the streets, rats multiplied, and the population doubled every 10 days. Into this gold-mad town poured every sharp operator on the continent. The gambling houses went up first, ringing Portsmouth Square, the Parker House, the El Dorado, the Bella Union, the Veranda, the Aguila de Oro. These were not back-alley card games. The Parker House, originally built as a hotel by Robert A. Parker, was quickly converted to a casino when the real money revealed itself. Professional gamblers paid $10,000 a month for the privilege of running their tables in its main room. At the peak of the rush, it was estimated that $500,000 in gold sat stacked on the Parker House tables on any given day. The El Dorado, owned by James McCabe and Thomas Chambers, flanked it on one side. The Bella Union flanked it on the other. Some of these establishments were run by gambling syndicates from France, and their interiors, oil lamp chandeliers, imported liquor, fine furniture, were built to make men who had spent weeks sleeping in mud feel like they had arrived somewhere that deserved their money. Badly drawn paintings of nude women adorned the walls of the best cafes. At the El Dorado, it was reported that $80,000 once changed hands on the turn of a single card. Liquor and female companionship were offered free of charge by the house as an incentive to keep the high rollers at the table. The house understood something fundamental. The real profit was not in the drinks or the girls. It was in the time a man spent sitting down. Every free whiskey bought another hour. Every hour bought another chance at his gold dust. The women arrived next. In 1848, 700 prostitutes came to San Francisco, mostly from Mexico, Peru, and Chile. A top prostitute could earn $200 to $500 a night, a sum that would have been unimaginable anywhere else in the country. Some were auctioned off from the decks of incoming ships. Café owners hired them to pose in their dining halls. Within months, a hierarchy formed. The parlor houses at the top, elegant and expensive. The cow yards in the middle, which doubled as apartment buildings and brothels. and the cribs at the bottom, where women worked in wooden stalls barely large enough to lie down in. San Francisco in 1850 had one woman for every 30 men. It would not reach anything close to parity until 1910. The economics of that imbalance drove nearly everything that happened on the Barbary Coast for the next 60 years. But the earliest years weren't called the Barbary Coast. That name came later. What existed first was Roar, a tent neighborhood called Little Chile, full of Latin American prostitutes and miners. And then Sydney Town, colonized by former convicts from Australia, men who had served time in Britain's penal colonies and arrived in San Francisco with the skills of professional criminals and absolutely no intention of panning for gold. They were called the Sydney Ducks, and by late 1849 they dominated the waterfront. They opened boarding houses and grog shops, robbed anyone who walked in, and, their signature move, set fires. San Francisco burned 6 times in 18 months between 1849 and 1851. The Sydney Ducks were behind most of it. They'd wait for southwesterly winds so their own neighborhood wouldn't catch, then put a torch to someone else's and loot in the chaos. The citizens of San Francisco, such as they were, responded with the most American possible solution. They organized themselves. In 1851, the first Vigilance Committee formed, the largest and most organized vigilante movement in the country's history. 2 of the Sydney Ducks, Samuel Whitaker and Robert Mackenzie, were arrested for arson, robbery, and burglary, given a quick trial, and hanged. The hangings worked. Within 2 weeks, Sydney Town was nearly empty. The remaining ducks fled south or shipped out, and for about 2 years the waterfront was almost respectable. Almost. And only for 2 years. By the early 1860s, the criminals were back, and this time they had a brand. Sometime in the mid-1860s, nobody knows exactly when, and nobody knows who said it first, the area around Pacific Street between Montgomery and Stockton began to be called the Barbary Coast, after the pirate-infested North African shore that had terrorized Mediterranean shipping for centuries. The name fit. From the end of the Civil War until the First World War, this small stretch of blocks, maybe 9 blocks total, with its heart on a 3-block run of Pacific Street, was the most concentrated vice district in the United States, and possibly the world. It outlasted every red light district of its era. New York's 5 Points had been tamed. New Orleans's Storyville was created by city ordinance in 1897 and shut down 20 years later. The Barbary Coast grew up on its own, was essentially unregulated for most of its existence, and held on for more than half a century. The question is why? And the answer is almost boringly simple: money, and the lack of anyone with both the power and the desire to stop the flow of it. Take the police. In 1871, Police Chief Crowley reported that San Francisco had exactly 100 officers for the entire city. 1 officer for every 1,445 inhabitants. New York, by contrast, had 1 for every 464. London had 1 for every 303. The Barbary Coast, in practical terms, was unpoliced. And the men who ran the city were in no hurry to change that, because the coast generated revenue, not just for the saloon keepers and madams, but for the politicians who collected graft, the property owners who charged rent, and the legitimate businesses that served the tens of thousands of sailors, miners, and visitors who cycled through. A writer named Albert S. Evans took some friends on a walking tour of Pacific Street at night in 1873, and he brought a policeman with them for safety. Even with the escort, Evans described the street as literally swarming with the scum of creation. A later writer, Benjamin Estelle Lloyd, tried to capture it in 1876 and could barely contain himself. Dance halls and concert saloons, he wrote, where blear-eyed men and faded women drink vile liquor, smoke offensive tobacco, engage in vulgar conduct, sing obscene songs, and say and do everything to heap upon themselves more degradation. opium dens where men and women lay sprawled in miscellaneous confusion, disgustingly drowsy or completely overcome. And then, as if exhausted by his own catalog, Lloyd concluded, "And hell, yawning to receive the putrid mass, is there also." He wasn't wrong. The historian Herbert Asbury, writing in 1933, claimed that for many years, especially during the 1860s and 1870s, not a single night passed without at least one murder on the Barbary Coast. That claim is almost certainly exaggerated. Asbury cited few specific sources and relied heavily on interviews with old-timers whose memories improved with retelling. But the district could be genuinely lethal, particularly for drunks and unwary men with visible bankrolls. What's harder to overstate is the sheer density of the operation. The business model of the coast was layered and efficient. At the top were the parlor houses, where the madam was an entrepreneur of genuine sophistication. Each house had its own branding, a motto framed in every room, a specialty, a reputation. The houses on Commercial Street each advertised a so-called virgin room, where a customer could be charged double or triple the going rate for an experience that was, of course, entirely theatrical. Below the parlor houses were the dance halls and concert saloons, the real engines of the nightly economy. Except for a couple of restaurants, that 3-block stretch of Pacific Street was almost wall-to-wall drinking establishments. The concert saloons featured bawdy skits and can-can dancers. The dance halls employed women called pretty waiter girls, who earned $15 to $25 a week to serve drinks, dance with customers, and, crucially, pick their pockets, splitting whatever they stole with management. The larger halls employed up to 50 women. The Barbary Coast even invented its own type of dance hall, different from anything in New York or Chicago. The only women present were employees, paid to dance, and paid a commission on every drink they convinced their partners to buy. During the 1870s, one Mexican fandango den dressed its girls in nothing more than red jackets, black stockings, garters, and slippers. The dress code was abandoned within weeks, not because of moral objections, but because the crowds became uncontrollable. The melodeons were a step up, a kind of cabaret originally named for the mechanical reed organs that had once provided their music. They featured songs, bawdy skits, and can-can dancers. The only women allowed inside were the waitresses and performers. The Bella Union ran a melodeon that made a genuine effort to feature notable talent, and it became the closest thing the coast had to a respectable theater, though that word has to be used carefully. Below the dance halls were the deadfalls, the lowest rung, where the bar was rough boards laid across barrels. The wine was raw alcohol with coloring. The benches were damp, and the sawdust on the floor was not changed often enough. And then there was shanghaiing, the industry that gave the English language a verb. When ships arrived in San Francisco, their crews deserted for the gold fields. By early 1850, over 700 ships sat derelict in Yerba Buena Cove, not a single one with a crew large enough to sail. Captains needed replacement sailors. They would pay blood money to men called crimps, who supplied the bodies, willing or not. The economics were straightforward. Sailors were entitled to 2 months' advance on their wages before a voyage, ostensibly to settle debts and outfit themselves for the trip. But the sailor never saw the money. It went to the crimp. Add the blood money on top, and a single warm body delivered to a ship was worth a tidy sum, enough to justify considerable effort and ingenuity in the acquisition. Crimps operated boarding houses along the waterfront, and their methods ranged from persuasion to drugging to outright kidnapping. Some bars reportedly had trap doors built into the floor. A woman known only as Miss Piggott ran one of the more efficient operations. Her technique, as described by the historian Herbert Asbury, was to seat her mark over a trap door, serve him a house special, whiskey, brandy, gin, and laudanum, and when the cocktail took effect, hit him over the head and pull the lever. He'd drop onto a mattress below. When he woke up, he'd be on a ship in the Pacific, bound for Shanghai, or worse, with 2 months' advance wages already collected by Miss Piggott. The run to Shanghai was particularly dreaded because getting home from China usually meant sailing all the way around the world, a trip that could take over a year. That voyage is where the word Shanghai comes from. A man named James Kelly, Shanghai Kelly, ran a boarding house on Pacific Street and later the Boston House at Davis and Chambers. The stories about him are heavily mythologized. 3 trap doors, unconscious sailors dumped through the floor, a birthday party on a chartered ship where he drugged the entire guest list and sold them all to waiting captains. How much of that is true is hard to say. The Reverend James Fell, who founded the Seamen's Institute in the 1890s as a safe haven for sailors, reported to the British government that shanghaiing was systematic and institutional, not the work of colorful rogues. It continued for over 50 years, from the gold rush until it was made a federal crime in 1915. The Barbary Coast invented its own economy, its own culture, and, almost inevitably, its own characters. The most emblematic was a man known only as Oofty Goofty. His real name was probably Leonard Borchardt. He arrived on the coast as a failed actor who had once performed as a sideshow wild man on Market Street, covered in road tar and horsehair, growling nonsense syllables from inside a cage. That career ended when the tar nearly killed him. He couldn't sweat through it and had to be doused in solvent on the roof of the receiving hospital. After that, Oofty Goofty discovered his true calling. He was apparently insensitive to pain. For years, he walked the bars of the Barbary Coast, offering himself as a punching bag. 10 cents bought you the right to kick him as hard as you could. A quarter got you a swing with a walking stick. 50 cents earned a full crack with a baseball bat, which he carried with him for the purpose. He made a reliable living at it until the night he offered the deal to John L. Sullivan, the heavyweight champion of the world. Sullivan hit him across the back with a billiard cue. It broke 3 vertebrae. Oofty Goofty walked with a limp for the rest of his life. What makes that story a Barbary Coast story, and not just a strange story, is the economics of it. A man could make a living getting beaten with a baseball bat because enough people on Pacific Street on any given night were drunk enough and flush enough to pay 50 cents for the experience. The market for violence was liquid, and the supply was willing. Through all of this, Pacific Street remained. The gambling dens burned down in the fires of 1849 and 1850 and 1851, and they were rebuilt. The vigilantes cleaned out Sydney town, and new operators moved in. The police made occasional raids that amounted to nothing. Reformers sermonized. And every night, the doors opened, the music started, and the money moved. By the 1890s and into the early 1900s, the coast had matured into something almost systematic. The establishments had names that ranged from the aspirational to the cheerfully obscene. The Dewdrop Inn, the Canterbury Hall, the Opera Comique, the Sign of the Red Rooster, the Living Flea, and, in a gesture of candor rare in any industry, Ye Old Whore Shop. The Bull Run on Pacific Street was run by a man named Ned Allen, who had earned the title the wickedest man in San Francisco, a competitive distinction in this neighborhood. Beneath the streets, Dead Man's Alley, Murder Point, and the tunnels of the Bull Run formed a network through which both stolen goods and stolen people could be moved without ever surfacing. The San Francisco Examiner, Hearst's paper, ran advertisements for the brothels so thinly veiled that the coast's regulars gave the paper its own nickname, the Whore's Daily Guide and Handy Compendium. One block in particular, Pacific between Kearny and Montgomery, earned a name that would stick for decades, Terrific Street. Then, at 5:12 in the morning on April 18, 1906, the San Andreas Fault slipped along a 270-mile segment, and the ground beneath San Francisco shook for over a minute. The earthquake itself was devastating, but it was the fire that followed, burning for 3 days, fed by broken gas mains and unfightable because the water mains had shattered too, that destroyed the city. Over 28,000 buildings burned. More than 3,000 people died. 80% of San Francisco was gone. The business district was leveled. The mansions on Nob Hill were rubble. And the Barbary Coast, every opium den, every crib, every parlor house, every deadfall, every dance hall, every melodeon, every concert saloon was turned to ash. The clergyman called it the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Divine retribution, they said, for the city's wicked ways. God had spoken. But there was a problem with the theology. A few blocks from the center of the Barbary Coast on Jackson Street stood a building that had been put up in 1866 by a businessman named Anson Parsons Hoteling. The building was Italianate with cast-iron shutters, fireproof construction as it happened, and inside it was the largest whiskey repository on the West Coast. When the fire reached Jackson Street, a Navy lieutenant named Frederick Newton organized an extraordinary effort. Salt water was pumped through hoses stretching 11 blocks from the Embarcadero, and when that wasn't enough, sewer water was pumped out of basements using wine pumps. Over 2 days of inferno, the Hoteling warehouse survived. The whiskey was saved. Every church in the neighborhood had burned to the ground. A local poet named Charles Kellogg Field wrote the only verse that needed writing. If, as they say, God spanked the town for being over frisky, why did he burn his churches down and save Hoteling's whiskey? The poem is still on a bronze plaque at 451 Jackson Street. The day after the fire, men lined up for blocks to patronize the brothels of Oakland, and the entrepreneurs of the Barbary Coast did not wait for the ashes to cool. Within a year, Pacific Street was open for business again. The first dive to reopen was the Seattle Saloon and Dance Hall near Kearney. The women employed there were paid $15 to $20 a week and were, following the custom of an earlier deadfall, forbidden from wearing underwear, a feature that was discreetly advertised in handbills distributed to saloons across the city. They were also entitled to half of whatever they could pick from the pockets of their dance partners. Management's chief complaint was that the girls were dishonest about reporting the amounts they had stolen. It was a complaint that could have been filed in any era of capitalism. While the city of San Francisco officially disdained the Barbary Coast, it took a private and not very secret pride in the district's worldwide fame as the wickedest place in America. It was good for business, not the vice business, but the tourism business. The coast drew visitors from around the world the way a condemned building draws a crowd. People wanted to see it before it was gone, and it was always about to be gone. The reformers were always about to win. That was part of the attraction. But the rebuilt coast was different. Not reformed exactly, not yet, but different in texture. The crude groggeries and the opium dens did not come back in their old numbers. The slave trade in Chinatown, which had supplied young Chinese girls to the cribs, effectively ended. What emerged in their place was something louder, flashier, and, improbably, more culturally significant than anything the old Barbary Coast had produced. The new Pacific Street was a street of dance halls, and the dance halls had evolved a business model of surprising sophistication. The biggest ones, the Hippodrome, the Thalia, the Midway, the Olympia, had installed something called slummers' balconies, raised galleries where middle-class San Franciscans and out-of-town tourists could sit above the dance floor and watch the spectacle below. The balconies charged premium prices, and the drinks cost more up there than they did on the floor. The owners understood that they were selling two products to two markets simultaneously: vice to the sailors and miners on the ground floor, and the spectacle of vice to the respectable classes in the gallery above. They even staged fake fights and scuffles on the dance floor for the benefit of the balcony crowd, who had come expecting to witness the depravity they'd heard about, and who might have been disappointed by the reality. The trick was to shock without repulsing, enough to justify the ticket price, not enough to send anyone home. And the dance halls needed music. Two black men, Louis Vernon Purcell and Sam King, had been railroad porters before they'd gone into the saloon business together in the 1890s, starting with a place near the Presidio that catered to African-American soldiers of the 24th Infantry, a Buffalo Soldier regiment. They called it Headquarters 24. By about 1901, they'd made their way to 520 Pacific Street, in the heart of the coast, where Purcell opened a place called the So Different Café. King opened the Needmore, just down the block. They were black and tan clubs, meaning all races were welcome, and they hired the best musicians they could find. What happened next was one of those accidents of culture that nobody plans and that changes everything. The musicians Purcell and King brought to Pacific Street played a new kind of music. Ragtime at first, then blues, then something that didn't yet have a settled name. The dancers who came to hear it invented new ways to move to it. The Texas Tommy, a partnered swing dance with aerial throws, was reportedly born at Purcell's, or possibly at the Thalia, a barn-sized dance hall up the block with double-tiered balconies and an 18-piece orchestra. The Turkey Trot, the Bunny Hug, the Grizzly Bear, the Chicken Glide, dances that would sweep the country, all started on these 3 blocks of Pacific Street. Newspaper readers from New York to Chicago knew that the Texas Tommy had come from the Barbary Coast. A pianist named Sid Leproti became the band leader at Purcell's So Different Café, and for 20 years he was the central musician of the district. His So Different Jazz Band may have been the first group in the country to use the word jazz in its name, a claim that is debated but not easily dismissed. Leproti's schedule was punishing. When business was good, the band played 26 to 30 dances an hour. Piano players taped their fingers and wore out a good piano in a year. Out of his 20 years on the coast, Leproti later recalled, 14 were played all night, every night. Up the block, Spider Kelly's was another black and tan club, and its owner knew exactly what the public wanted. Kelly staged racy floor shows and ran one of the rowdiest rooms on Terrific Street. It was rumored that bullets from a bar next door occasionally came through the wall. In response, Kelly installed a sheet iron boilerplate behind his bar to block strays, a renovation that says as much about the neighborhood's insurance situation as it does about its nightlife. A local journalist visited in 1919 and wrote that an hour spent in Spider's Café is a sure cure for the tired feeling and will remove to oblivion all forms of melancholy. The photos that survive from Spider Kelly show something unexpected. Well-dressed young couples, men in suits and women in white blouses, dancing the Turkey Trot with the focused joy of people who are exactly where they want to be. His clarinet player, Clem Raymond, had been trained in New Orleans by the master Lorenzo Tio, Jr. Freddie Keppard, the New Orleans trumpet king, played the coast before World War I. Jelly Roll Morton, who called himself the inventor of jazz, made his Barbary Coast debut around the same time. Joe King Oliver brought his Creole jazz band up from Chicago in 1921, and his bass player earned the nickname that tobacco-chewin', wall-spittin' band after sitting in at Purcell's. The district drew famous visitors, too. Sarah Bernhardt came, Anna Pavlova came, Sophie Tucker and Al Jolson performed on Terrific Street. For a brief period, roughly 1907 to 1917, the Barbary Coast was simultaneously one of the most dangerous and one of the most musically innovative places in North America. It was a place where an African-American cafe owner on a disreputable street in a city on the edge of the continent was incubating the dance forms and musical language that would define American popular culture for the next century. And it was during this period, the coast's unexpected peak, that the forces that would kill it finally gathered enough strength to act. William Randolph Hearst's San Francisco Examiner, the same paper that had been nicknamed the Whore's Daily Guide for its barely disguised brothel advertisements, reversed course in spectacular fashion. Just before the elections of September 1913, the Examiner launched a full-page editorial crusade demanding that the Barbary Coast should be wiped out. The irony was thick enough to walk on, but nobody mentioned it. 10 days later, the Police Commission adopted a series of resolutions. No dancing in any establishment that served alcohol. No women, employees or patrons, permitted in any saloon in the district, and even electric signs were banned. The order was precise and lethal. It did not outlaw the saloons. It outlawed everything that made the saloons profitable. Some bars fired their women and became straight drinking establishments, which, without the dancing and the pretty waiter girls, were just bars, indistinguishable from 100 others in the city. Others closed entirely. The larger dance halls tried to survive by relocating to other neighborhoods and disguising themselves as dance academies, but they never recovered their Pacific Street crowds or their Pacific Street energy. In 1914, the State Red Light Abatement Act empowered officials to seize property used for prostitution, not just to arrest the people inside, but to take the buildings themselves. It was an attack on the landlords, which is to say, an attack on the money. In February 1917, a focused police operation effectively blockaded the district. 83 brothels were shuttered, and 1,073 prostitutes were evicted from their quarters. Mayor James Rolfe made the closures stick. The brothels did not reopen. Shanghaiing had been made a federal crime in 1915. And then, in 1919, the Volstead Act made the manufacture, sale, and transport of alcohol illegal in the United States, and whatever oxygen remained for the old Barbary Coast was gone. The Barbary Coast had one last gasp. In 1921, a few clubs tried to start up again on Pacific Street, selling near beer and featuring a handful of dancing girls. The police moved immediately. Sid Leproti remembered the exact moment. In March 1921, a policeman named Corporal Alperts walked into the club and stopped the music at 1 o'clock in the morning. Leproti was playing a tune of his own composition called 4 O'Clock. As the police escorted Leproti and his bandmates down the street toward the Hall of Justice, the pianist turned to his clarinet player and said, "That's the last of the Barbary Coast." He was right. Pacific Street was renamed Pacific Avenue in 1929, a small, quiet act of civic erasure. In the 1930s, the block was rebranded as International Settlement, with arched signs at either end and nightclubs bearing names like the Arabian Nights and the Gay and Frisky, trading on a sanitized version of the coast's reputation to attract tourists for the 1939 Golden Gate Exposition. Frank Sinatra filmed scenes for Pal Joey on the block in 1957. But the real action had already moved north to Broadway and Columbus, where strip clubs and jazz joints kept a faint echo of the old days alive for a few more decades. In the 1950s, something else happened, something that would have struck anyone from the old coast as deeply, cosmically funny. A decorator named Dorothy Needler Lawenda and her husband Harry purchased the old Hoteling warehouse at 451 Jackson Street and turned it into a showroom for wholesale interior design. Other designers followed. The brick warehouses of the former Barbary Coast, the ones that had survived the earthquake because of their cast-iron shutters and heavy construction, became of all things fashionable. Their high ceilings and open floor plans, built to store whiskey barrels and smuggled goods, turned out to be exactly what mid-century furniture showrooms wanted. Antique dealers, fabric houses, rug importers, and eventually advertising agencies filled the buildings where crimps had once drugged sailors and dropped them through trap doors. On Osgood Alley, 1 block long, the tenants over the years included the comedian Lenny Bruce, the fan dancer Sally Rand, and the German film director Wim Wenders, a succession that felt almost scripted. The neighborhood was rechristened Jackson Square, and in 1971 it was added to the National Register of Historic Places, San Francisco's first historic district. One promotional pamphlet from the era noted, with a decorator's gentle understatement, that Jackson Square's reclamation had uplifted what was old-time San Francisco's notorious Barbary Coast from raffishness to refinement. Today, 470 Pacific Avenue is Quint's, a 3 Michelin-star restaurant. 490 Pacific is Cotonia, its sister, where you can eat handmade gnocchi at an outdoor table under a tree on the quiet sidewalk. The designer Johnny Ive, who shaped the look of every Apple product for 2 decades, purchased the old Little Fox Theater building at 535 Pacific Avenue for nearly $60 million to house his design collective, Love From. A 4-story building at 530 Jackson Street sold for $38 million. Venture capitalists and tech firms compete for space in the brick and iron buildings that the Sydney Ducks once set on fire for fun. And at 555 Pacific Avenue, the old Hippodrome Dance Hall, rebuilt after the 1906 earthquake with a circus-like arcade facade, the place where the Turkey Trot and the Texas Tommy were danced by women in torn dresses and silk stockings, sits with its facade stripped of its decorative panels, which were sold to an art collector in New York in 1937. The building has been looking for a new owner. Beneath the streets, the ships are still there. About 40 gold rush vessels lie buried under the financial district and the Embarcadero, entombed in landfill since the 1850s and 1860s. One of them, the Rome, was rediscovered in the 1990s when the city dug a tunnel for a streetcar extension. The N-Judah line now passes through its forward hull every day. Thousands of commuters ride through the bones of a ship that brought fortune seekers to Yerba Buena Cove, and not one of them knows it. There is a wavy line set into the sidewalk on Hotaling Place, San Francisco's oldest alley, 1 block long, running between Jackson and Washington Streets. The line marks the original shoreline. Everything east of it, every building, every street, every office, is built on fill, on landfill and sunken ships and garbage, and the accumulated ambitions of people who looked at shallow water and saw real estate. That instinct, to look at something worthless and see a fortune in it, to build fast and extract hard and worry about the consequences later, is the instinct that built the Barbary Coast. The ships that carried the miners became the ground the saloons stood on. The saloons that robbed the miners funded the politicians who protected the saloons. The dance halls that shocked the respectable citizens incubated the music the whole country would dance to. And Pacific Street, the first road to cut through the hills, carried all of it. The gold dust and the blood money, the ragtime and the laudanum, the silk stockings and the trapdoors. Until one night in March 1921, when a policeman walked in and a pianist stopped playing a song called 4 o'clock, 3 hours before it would have been true.